My name is Claudia Ringler, and I am the co-lead of the CGIAR initiative on NEXUS Gains. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on gender and energy, measures to accelerate equity and social inclusion in South Asia's rural energy transition. This is a really important topic because universal access to affordable, clean energy continues to be a challenge across the globe and in South Asia. Access by women and marginalized groups to clean energy services and green technologies remains constrained by women's social position and gender norms, as well as gender-blind energy policies and institutions. The cost to women's well-being and rural economic growth from inequitable access, policies, and institutions are considerable but seldom assessed. Today, we will hear about many of those reasons for the gender and energy conundrum, discuss learnings from case studies on inclusive energy access, and present recommendations to improve equity and inclusion in energy access in India and Nepal. In terms of run of show today, we have 3 speakers and 2 panelists who will comment on the presentations and also answer the questions that we have for them and hopefully that you all have for them. Without any further ado, we will start with our first presentation, which is a pre-recorded video on gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI, in a just energy transition with a focus on Nepal. And the video was put together by Shrishti Shakia, and the work was also done by Marlene Bouchy, and they're both with the International Water Management Institute in Nepal. If you have questions on anything that you heard in the video or general questions on gender and the rural energy transition in South Asia, please add them to the Q&A as soon as they come to your mind. And so we'll now start, as I said, with our first presentation, which is a video on GESI, or gender equality and social inclusion in Nepal.
Hello everyone, I am Shrishti Shakia and I am from Nepal. I'm here to make a presentation based on our recent research. So the research had focused on the institutional and policy processes within the energy sector to understand why Nepal's public energy institutions, despite a constitutional commitment to gender equality, seem so reluctant to mainstream GESI within its policies and practice. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 women and 33 men working in Nepal's energy sectors at the federal, provincial, and local level. And we used the analytical framework of Payne, which talks about 3 major barriers that limit gender policy development. Our key results are that we have divided the results at the federal, provincial, and the local level. So talking about the pragmatic barriers, as you can see, the different institutions at the national level have different levels of policy. These examples can highlight that there was first no consistency within the public sector institutions in the way GESI policy is implemented, with some organizations like the AEPC equipped with a policy, or some with it, like the NEA, which is the Nepal Electricity Authority, equipped with a strategy, and some like the Ministry of Energy Water Resources, which is the line ministry, without even a policy. Second, GESI-related activities only happen through the support of externally funded projects, for instance, the AEPC, which has been supported over the years by the development organizations. And the reason that AEPC states that they have a GESI policy is to get an accreditation from GCF. This kind of shows that there are issues around the lack of financial resources and skilled human capacity to incorporate GESI into policy and programs. This also poses the questions of the nature of the epistemic community involved in policy development. For instance, who is involved in the definition of the problem? Government of Nepal staffs and development partner respondents tend to explain that policies are developed in a consultative manner, inviting different representatives from diverse stakeholders to conduct workshops where documents are drafted and discussed, while a lot of non-government respondents tend to say that they are single-handedly written by external Nepali or international consultants. If you look at the bureaucracy in Nepal, they're dominated by elite groups. Women are not present in senior positions, and it's mostly captured by elite caste groups. It is not really clear on what data is being used to develop these policies. Besides the rationale offered by the Constitution on gender equality and non-discrimination, the policy documents do not really have data that support the rationale behind the development of the GESI policy. Moreover, the energy institutions do not really collect social development data. So this absence of data makes it really difficult to measure change or outcomes of implementation of GESI policy across the sector, thus depriving the government of valuable feedback and of updated data that would be potentially useful when revising policies. At the provincial level as well, they face similar issues. There is really a lack of staff and there is a constant turnover, which is resulting in the delay in institutionalization of the functions of the province. And it also includes the GESI and energy-related policy making and implementation. The lack of GESI data is only one issue amid a larger challenge of data paucity. It also explains the lack of data available to inform policy development. At the local level as well, it faces the same issues as the province. In fact, in one of our sample local government units, the recent GESI policy had been developed by a project officer on a temporary contract without any collaboration from the Palika's permanent staff at the Women Development section, who were not aware that even there was a policy. When there is a GESI policy, it was mostly developed by external consultants through projects like the provincial and local government support program, which is funded by a development partner. The other issue is around the conceptual barriers. So the lack of resources explains the gaps in investment in data collection and skill development. In the case of GESI, this leads to an inadequate conceptual understanding of two important concepts, GESI itself and policy. So GESI has been considered to be the need to focus on women, their needs, and their participation in decision-making positions, and only rarely as process to rebalance power relations between genders and social groups. Because there is so much focus on women, the social inclusion dimension in GESI is overlooked in definitions and activities. Besides ensuring some degree of representation of women and disadvantaged groups on committees and activities, there is no specific budget allocated to support activities addressing social justice and inequality. The narrow interpretation of GESI can also be traced back to the influence of multilateral and bilateral development partners, given the prevalence of donor support in GESI policy development and integration of GESI in donor-supported projects. At Palika level, there is a women's development section, and the head of the women's development section is appointed as the GESI focal point of the Palika. This means that the budget and programs of this section is limited to conducting activities for women. And moreover, the GESI focus components of other sections of the Palikas tend to be conducted without any collaboration with the women's development section or the GESI lead. But also the idea of policy and how their conceptual understanding of policy was that it is a set of rigid guidelines or procedures rather than an overarching document providing broad directions for the country. So the policy or the absence thereof of policy was constantly put forward as an explanation for action or inaction. The third is the political outcomes, which is also considered the black box of politics. The local level power dynamics is such that, according to the Local Governance Operation Act, this should be the actual hierarchy of positions at the local level, but that does not happen. Somewhere, the CAO has more power than the mayor, or in some local levels, the ward chairs had more power than the mayor or the chief administrative officer. So there were a lot of informal power dynamics working. Likewise, around the decision-making processes. This is generally how the decision-making should be taking place. In practice, the influence of political networks is such that the process is not followed as such. There's a lack of transparency on how decisions are made. So when we're asking, is there genuine interest on GESI? We see that GESI is rarely a priority, especially when budgets are tight at all levels. The women are actually absent from all executive functions. If we look at the local level chairs, only 2% are women, and 1% of the only 1% of the ward chairs are women. Moreover, the allocation of budget to the women's development section, as well as the GESI budget, is not really clear. It happens on an ad hoc basis, and there are really delays in allocation. And there's a limited interest in GESI, which may in part explain the slow implementation of GESI policies, the ongoing skills and knowledge deficit of elected representatives, together with the vacant administrative positions that we've already discussed, continue to be a hurdle to local governance. So the limited capacity and interest in implementing GESI policies at the local level are compounded by political instability at the national level. Federalism is relatively new in Nepal, and all policies and administrative processes have not been finalized. There's a gap in staffing and staffing processes. There is lack of clarity on the devolution and implementation of powers at the three spheres. So JESSI implementation can be partly attributed to these transitional teething processes. Policymaking in Nepal at the federal level suffered from a silos approach, and it lacks structural incentives to collaborate. General issues around engineering and bureaucracy being male-dominated, and there's a lot of patriarchal thinking around how these function. And also JESSI is kind of interpreted as targeting and not about changing norms. So there's a limited attention to what happens when quotas are filled. Moreover, the focus on JESSI policies within projects, especially on donor-funded ones, and the view that JESSI policy is necessary mostly in the context of project delivery, possibly objectivizes JESSI as a standalone project-related intervention, even though it is meant to be mainstream. Thank you so much.
Excellent overview over gender equality and social inclusion challenges in energy sector policies of Nepal. So what I heard is that there is a little bit of a misconception, thinking that gender equality means that you have to bring some women into positions rather than to better understand how to ensure that women have access to clean energy technologies, and rather than to understand that this really relates to women and men, and it's not like, oh, we need one woman somewhere. So let's hope we can do better on this in Nepal, and we will hear later from our discussant and panelist more on this topic. And before that, we'll move over to our second speaker, Dr. Neha Durga, and together with Shrishti Mishra, both from the International Water Management Institute, have worked on India, and specifically they have developed learnings from case studies on inclusive energy access. I think Neha, you will present. Over to you, please.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks everyone for joining. Srishti and I will be talking about this study which we recently did. The main objective of the study was to find out if energy interventions can empower women. So I'll straight away start. So energy is a critical tool for development, and it's been seen, and there's a lot of research around that, how energy poverty impacts women more given the existing structural inequities. Essentially, because of their increased vulnerability into society, they have less capabilities to leverage energy for improving their well-being. So capability has been, it is defined in the literature as a combination of agency and resources. And it is assumed that, technological options can improve the capability of women, but essentially it doesn't happen, because new technology tend to adopt the existing structural inequities and bypass any structural change that until it is supported by very strong policy measures, which can incentivize behavior change at social, individual, and collective level. So that essentially is the background that why we wanted to study energy and gender or women empowerment at the same level. So our main question is whether energy as a tool can be leveraged for improving women's capability, and what are the limitations in doing so. So we developed case studies, and then we synthesized these case studies to understand what energy interventions can do and how it can improve the resources and agency of women, and what energy interventions cannot do. In order to do that, we developed a database. We then analyzed those case studies and developed a typology of these interventions. We selected a geography and we visited these cases, and then obviously we synthesized them. So there were around 50 cases which we found while doing a secondary research, and found there are 4 major categories of these cases. So the first category was where there's a capital investment done by the promoter or by the implementer, and which falls into the two categories, where in one case the assets or the product was basically transferred, or there were specialized products which were created. And the second major category was local institutions were supported, either SHGs, collectives, or individuals, or there was a last mile support through institutions. The third major category was related to financing and credit support, where specialized financial products were actually created. And fourth major category was skilling. Either women were trained in a special special training was given, or they were incubated or trained for a specialized business activity. So we saw that a lot of interventions actually did not have only one thing, but a combination of more than a design element. And actually, it improves the impact of intervention on the ground. But obviously, the measurement becomes more difficult because it's difficult to see or understand that which particular element is actually contributing to the impact. But that's a give and take of the design of the intervention. So this is a snapshot of those 50 cases. On the word cloud, you can see the different names of the cases or the interventions which were there. And on the right side, basically, the major implementers and the partners who did these interventions on ground. So our geographical focus for the study was Bihar, and we filtered close to 9 cases, and then we visited them. And we did the fieldwork in Samastipur and Gaya with the help of our partners, which were Aga Khan Rural Support Program and Jivika, which is a livelihood program supported by World Bank in Bihar. So I basically categorized these 9 cases into 4 categories further, just for the clarity of presentation. That the first case was about the solar irrigation pumps, which were run by self-help groups. And the category of the case is essentially an asset transfer to the local institution. It was done in Samastipur by AKRSPI, and they were dedicated groups and they were mixed groups. Basically, there was either single SHG which was running this solar irrigation pumps, or there were a mix of multiple women from different SHGs who were running these solar pumps for basically expanding irrigation access to their member as well as other farmers in the village. The second one is JYS, which is supported by Jivika. So JYS stand for Jivika Women Institutions and businesses on the ground, in which they do skilling and entrepreneurship, supported with an institution building and support. So it's essentially SHGs which are coming together and building a network of entrepreneurs to sell solar products on the ground. It is their main factory is in Gaya, but Jivika has an office in Patna, and they are doing these solar marts which are being opened across the state. So it's a community-owned company essentially. Then the third category is basically a Pooja Sakhi, again an entrepreneurship program. And the fourth category is basically different products. There was a maize sheller given to an SHG, a biogas system, BLDC fan, solar chula, subsea cooler, etc. And these are spread in Samastipur and Gaya both, different products under the category of asset transfer. So the findings are basically we're looking at 2 things: resources, which are defined by improvement in income, and or the convenience, if it has been improved, or the agency, which I'll cover in the next slide. So in case of findings, we see that there are only 4 cases where there has been a significant improvement in income, and only 3 cases where the convenience was improved, and only 2 cases actually where convenience and income was improved. In the rest of the cases, either we are not very sure that it was improved, we were not able to interpret well, or we were actually sure that it did not improve. So that is why only 2 cases where we find that income and convenience improved. The second major thing which we saw was that either the technology was important or the women were important. When we're moving on to the agency was defined as the 5 parameters, whether they are, say over the productive resources is improving, or the control over income is improving, independent movement, time use, and leadership. These are the 5 categories, and we saw one very important thing, that if there is an improvement in agency, there is an increase in the workload. Second thing which we saw was that no energy intervention actually improved control over income. Even if it increased income, it did not improve the control over income.
2 minutes.
Yeah. So the key findings are, if whether energy is designed as a mean or as an end. If it is designed as a mean, then there's a scope to define the end, and therefore there's a scope to have a significant gendered outcome. If energy is the end, then they'll benefit everyone irrespective of gender, and the impact on women will be insignificant. And there's a higher probability of incorporating the existing inequities. So that's basically the trade-off. And also, if the gender takes precedence, then also significant work is needed to assess market, develop products, and so on and so forth. So there's a significant market research component which is needed, which is missing, and which we call as the product participant conundrum. That it's basically essentially very, very important to have viable business in order to have energy as a tool to improve the viability or the attractiveness of the business. Otherwise, it will end up reinforcing inequality. And what energy interventions cannot deliver. So there is empowerment cannot happen locally and needs a systematic institutional support. Agency can be improved, but under certain conditions and household support and local conditions, but also to a very limited extent. So maize sheller essentially, or the products can improve a lot of convenience and income, but they cannot, essentially they cannot reduce the participation barriers from the family. They cannot ensure that the family supports the women in doing these activities or incentivizing other members of the family in doing these activities. So that doesn't sort of change the household dynamics in any way. So, and also accessible and affordable energy can improve the viability, hence income generation, not necessarily the control. So the other two cases, we found these two cases essentially, which are not at the intersection of energy and gender per se, but we found them to have a significant impact on, I would say, in agency of the women in certain ways, not exactly the way we were seeing. Bank Sakhi was a program where women were beneficiary as well as participants, and they provided easy access to basic services, basic banking services to other women. And it reduced the barriers to access formal services, otherwise, which is very difficult. And e-rickshaw, which basically was driven by 100% of the women, actually, when the users was 90%, significantly improved rural mobility among women. So it reduced their dependency on men for accessing health, education, and other services. So these two are, which did not look like energy interventions, but energy is an enabler and a tool, but actually had an impact on the, as we could see, but more research is needed to basically identify the output pathways. But yes, on a face of it, it looks like that they had been very, very successful interventions. So to conclude, I'll just take 10 seconds to conclude that affordable energy is a necessary condition for sustainable livelihoods, but not a sufficient condition, which is assumed, I mean, for improving the agency of the women, which is assumed to be improved if livelihoods are improved, which again is a very straightforward assumption. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I think a lot of interesting case studies, a lot of food for thought from India. And we are now moving back to Nepal with our last presentation. Will be presented by Dr. Musna Alvi and Tushar Singh, both from the International Food Policy Research Institute. And they will focus on linkages between energy, access, and women's empowerment. So over to Musna and Tushar, please. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad to sort of follow up on these two presentations, especially Neha and Shrishti's, because I think we kind of build on some of the questions that she has raised. So I'm presenting this jointly with my colleague Tushar Singh. We are both based at the New Delhi office of the International Food Policy Research Institute. And we'll be talking to you about some steps we've taken towards developing some measure of women's empowerment in the energy space. So what is empowerment? As part of measuring or quantifying empowerment, we focus on measuring agency, which is often operationalized in terms of decision-making power or ability. But why this focus on an agency? And the reason is that when about 10 years ago, when the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index was developed, and I encourage you to sort of go back and look at the rich literature we have on that, there were already very good indicators that measured women's access to resources and as well as women's achievements. So things like yields, profit, expenditures. We knew how to measure those things, but we knew very little on how to measure agency. And so there was a deliberate decision to focus on agency in WEA and the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. And we kind of use that reasoning as we sort of move towards how to quantify empowerment in energy. So based on literature review, we identified three critical components as being essential to energy empowerment. And we test these through various sort of empirical means. The first is the decision around which source of energy to use and the procurement of that energy source. Next, we look at decision-making on changing the energy source, and we frame this as sort of changing it from an unclean source to a clean source of energy. And finally, we assess if women have access to mechanized assets, and we make a deliberate decision to sort of delineate ownership from access, and we focus on access to mechanized assets. And we also make a distinction between assets or decision-making over energy sources for domestic and leisure use, as well as assets that are used for income or generating purposes. We did data collection in 3 countries, India, Nepal, and Pakistan, but we'll be focusing on results from Nepal, where we covered 1,000 households in the Tarai and Mid-Hills region. We had, these were intra-household surveys, so we surveyed both men and women within the same household on a variety of modules, including both energy uses for domestic and productive purposes. Before I dive into sort of the energy and gender specific results, just sort of an overall picture of what women's empowerment looks like in Nepal. We find significant regional disparity. Women's empowerment is much higher in the Mid-Hills region compared to Tarai. But encouragingly, majority of women seem to live in households where they achieve gender parity. But what contributes majority to disempowerment overall? We find that excessive workload, especially in Tarai, lack of group membership, and inadequate credit access are among the biggest contributors. And additionally, women are also constrained in their control over use of income. What does the energy use portfolio look like in Nepal? We find here also there is strong disparity in terms of various access to energy sources. For example, in electricity, we find about near universal access to electricity connections in the Tarai region, but only about 43% households in the hills had access to domestic electricity connection. Similarly, we find that firewood and crop residue are the main source of cooking fuel for most of households. And even where LPG does exist, firewood and dung cake continue to be used for meeting supplemental fuel needs. Similar trends we observe in access to electricity on farm, as well as access to mechanized irrigation equipment. Next, we look at decisions on which energy source to use and the procurement of that energy source. And we find that when it comes to the source of cooking fuel, women say that they do decide on which sort of source to use, but the procurement of that source is predominantly done by male members. And this is confirmed when we ask those questions either to women or men. In terms of energy sources for household heating and lighting, again, we find decisions on which source to use and the procurement are done mostly by men. In energy sources for use in agriculture, decisions on which type to use and the procurement of that type are also done by male members of the households. The only exception being where women are the heads of the household. In terms of decision making around changing the energy source, which is a very crucial aspect that as we try to transition towards clean energy sources, women had very limited involvement in decision making for both domestic as well as productive use. I'll hand over now to Tushar for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Muzna. Hi, everyone. I'll mainly be focusing on some descriptive evidence we have from Nepal that explores gender disparities in ownership of energy assets. Now, on this table on this slide, we have the various assets that we will be talking about, but I will quickly summarize them for you. We have non-mechanized and mechanized farm equipments, non-farm business equipments, small and large consumer durables, digital assets, and transport means. Okay, now moving on to the findings, the data reveals that men have higher individual ownership and access to most assets, especially mechanized ones. For example, 33% of men own mechanized assets like tractors and power tillers individually, whereas only 9% of women claim individual ownership over these assets. Similarly, when we look at mechanized irrigation assets like diesel and solar pumps, 24% of men have individual ownership compared to a mere 9.6% of women. Interestingly, when it comes to household durables, women appear to have a higher unrestricted access, especially in assets integral to household management like cook stoves, showcasing a gender division in asset accessibility. Now, coming to the technology, there is a tech gap with more men owning smartphones and traditional phones, linking them to a broader digital world. For example, we find 66% of men own smartphones compared to just 49% of women. And with respect to traditional cell phones, 72% of men own these versus 54% of women. Now this isn't just about like having a fancier gadget. It's about having access to the digital world, which opens doors to so many information and opportunities. Coming to transportation, it also unfolds a different narrative. While there is a near parity in overall ownership, individual ownership presents a divide, where 34% of men own these means of transport versus 25% of women who own these transport. And this disparity extends to unrestricted access as well, with 97% of men enjoying this privilege compared to 90% of women. Lastly, though our discussion like till now has like circled around ownership and access to mechanized assets, it is enlightening to contrast it with non-mechanized assets as well, because as it's shown in the table, gender disparities are evidently sharper in mechanized equipment, mechanized assets. For instance, women's ownership is low for both asset type, mechanized and non-mechanized, yet their unrestricted access reveals more autonomy over non-mechanized assets, highlighting the rift between just like ownership and having the liberty to utilize them. Can we move to the next slide, Muzna? Yeah. Okay, now let's see how caste influences energy asset access. Here we extend our analysis into 4 distinct groups: upper caste, Janjati, other caste, and Dalits. Here, the data reveals a pattern where men generally have higher individual ownership rates across all caste groups. And again, this is particularly noticeable in the ownership rates of mechanized farm equipments and mechanized farm equipments and non-farm business equipments, along with transportation assets. Additionally, upper caste households also tend to have like higher ownership across most of these assets. And there is a progressive increase in ownership from Dalit to upper caste groups. When it comes to
1 minute, please. Yeah.
Oops. Okay. When it comes to basic assets like non-mechanized farm equipment and small consumer durables, higher ownership is observed across all castes. Again, as we touched upon earlier, there is a noticeable low ownership of mechanized and high-value assets, but this is like noticeably more for Dalit groups. Coming to technology, again, we see a digital divide along caste lines. In summary, the trend is clear. The ownership rates rise from Dalit to upper caste groups, which reaffirms the anticipated correlation between caste status and asset ownership as portrayed in the data. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So we also examined how education influences energy assets, and the essence is very clear. As education rises, so does asset ownership, but gender disparities still persist, with men owning more of these assets in every education group. So I'll skim through this. We can move to the next slide. Yeah. So to conclude, all these findings reiterate that while there is extensive evidence that shows how energy access leads to positive outcomes, these benefits are not equally allocated for. These are not equally allocated for all, especially in the global south. Secondly, simply ensuring household access to energy does not guarantee that all members of the household will utilize it in an equitable manner. So it is important to understand how different people perceive these benefits from access and energy use. Lastly, another important aspect to bear in mind is that a lot of existing studies till now seems to interpret energy access and energy use interchangeably. And most of these studies pivot around the narrative of women's empowerment as a result of energy use, sidelining it as a potential factor that in the first place influences energy use. So yeah, to conclude, when we start distinguishing between these two, a lot of nuances will come up, which can then help in developing gender-friendly energy policies and programs. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Okay, wow. So that was a whirlwind of data and new information on gender and energy in South Asia. And so before we come to the Q&A, so please actually feel free to add more questions into the chat. I know it's a lot in the Q&A, box, a lot to digest, but if you have questions to any of the presenters or to our upcoming discussants, now is a good time to add your question. But I first have a question each to our 2 discussants, and I'd like to start with Dr. Nikhil Gakkar. He is an experienced scientist in the field of renewable energy with a demonstrated history in research and administration at the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. He received a PhD on solar energy, which is obviously a perfect field to join us today. And he works on all types of renewable energies, especially solar thermal, solar water pumping system, and solar biomass hybrid systems. And also very exciting, he told us that he holds a patent on solar energy. And of course, he also has published widely. So my question to Dr. Gakkar is, how does your ministry, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy in India, try to increase women's access to clean energy technologies given what we have heard today, which obviously Nepal, India, similar challenges. What works and what does not work? Over to you, Dr. Nikhil.
Thank you, Claudia. Actually, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy is supporting various schemes. And of course, these schemes are gender neutral. So, but some of the schemes are specifically women-centric. And specifically, if I'm talking about the biogas scheme, which basically provides support for the clean energy cooking. Similarly, in terms of solar energy, we have various schemes like off-grid schemes and on-grid schemes. In on-grid schemes, we have a rooftop panel scheme where the beneficiaries, specifically women or men, they can apply and they can install the solar panels on their household. Similarly, in the off-grid schemes, we have different categories like solar water pumping system, decentralized renewable energy schemes like solar dryer or some livelihood schemes where they can actually implement the renewable energy or actually use the clean energy for the facility of their household activities. So this is one of the impact. Some of the products are actually creating impact in their daily life, daily activities, or improving their incomes also. One of the presenters, specifically for the Indian side, they have presented the case studies, and I would like to add that one of the Indian scheme that is basically on the solar study lamp that created one of the self-help group with the help of IIT Bombay, and that is creating, improving the lifestyle of the women. So with these schemes, specifically the decentralized renewable energy schemes, the ministry is facilitating the gender equality and of course the women to empower. So if you're asking me what works and what not works, I can clearly say that this specifically the decentralized technologies which can have actual impact in the lifestyle, that will definitely work. And of course, the ministry is coming up with the new livelihood scheme in which they can provide facility, they can provide support for the various solar products like solar refrigerator, solar dryer, biomass dryer. So these are the upcoming, the schemes through which the ministry is providing support.
But do you keep track of how many women benefit specifically?
Yes, of course. Definitely. I'll give you one example that, for example, in solar water pumping system, we have around 15 to 20% beneficiaries, farmers who are actually women. Of course, it varies from state to state, but yes, we have the data.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. I'd like to now move over to our second discussant, Ms. Resha Pia. She's the energy advisor at the British Embassy in Kathmandu. She is also the senior responsible officer for the Nepal Renewable Energy Program and oversees UK AIDS work in the energy sector in Nepal. She has also worked at various other agencies previously, including the Alternative Energy Promotion Center. I think that was discussed in one of the presentations. Also Windrock International, Practical Action, Helvetas. And she has a background in renewable energy engineering and energy environmental management. So my question to you, Resha, is how does the British Embassy in Kathmandu support integration of gender and social inclusion in the energy sector policy in Nepal and maybe also beyond Nepal in South Asia? Over to you, Resha, please.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, for this question. I think I need to acknowledge that the presentation that the presenter made was very clear, concise, and very informative. And the presentation itself speaks a lot about what we do in Nepal, right? Therefore, if I talk about the British Embassy, then British Embassy recognize the need to enhance the role and the meaningful contribution of women and disadvantaged people in every aspect of energy sector. Either it's in the policy and decision making, like building the capacity of the policy makers and decision makers so that they are enabled to make a right decision. And also in the supply chain, because in one presentation we also saw that we also need to empower women to participate in the value chain of renewable energy, which I think British Embassy is doing that. And also in the access and the use of energy, like ownership of the renewable energy technology, increasing access of the renewable energy technology and getting benefit out of the use of renewable energy technology. This is how we focus. And we at British Embassy we mainstream gender equality and social inclusion in all of its program, and it's from the design phase, from implementation and monitoring and evaluation, and even we generate the learnings about after the implementation of project, how the project went, particularly on the focus of gender equality and inclusion. And we put effort to make sure all intervention of the British Embassy are based on the good social analysis, design its intervention with the clear approach of JC issues. Therefore, if you see most all the British Embassy program, then JC is considered as one of the cross-cutting component of all the programs. And gender equality and inclusion features are prominently in embassy country plan too. And also our approach to JC has not been only to support the compliance, because most of the program they think that okay, this much women are reached, therefore we complied. But we think that we need to extend our ambition through the clear and structured approach, and JC needs to be integrated into the program result, key performance indicator, and the key activities. The embassy intervention has strengthened and improved the systems and the process of becoming more inclusive and change harmful social norm, which is I think very important in context of the countries, developing countries like Nepal. And in addition, as you mentioned, embassy also funds data and the evidence work, because whatever we do with, like whether it's delivering the right thing or not, we want to measure that. Therefore we do have a strong monitoring, evaluation, and the learning things in all the programs that we support, and it's focused on gender and social inclusion. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so it looks like very strong focus also in Nepal from in this case from the British Embassy. But given that the analysis that was presented on Nepal, the integration of JESI in energy policy didn't look very integrative at this point. It looks like rather there's a very strong exclusion. While there's an active commitment to JESI, the actual integration and implementation is still lacking. So what do you think is the number one lever to really make a difference on JESI in Nepal? In addition to everything you're doing, because it obviously hasn't reached the top.
Yeah, actually, like what the presenter mentioned, it's correct, because the presenter also mentioned that our this federalism is quite new to Nepal. We are slightly the constitution has given certain mandate which has not been 100% translated as we expected, but things are, I would say, still moving ahead, growing, improving. Because if you see, though it's morely supported from the development partners like FCDO and other development partners, but Nepal government is really positive to take the suggestions from the development partner, and they are trying to do that. Since we are quite new to this area, therefore this is taking lots of time. It's not only about having putting something into the policies. The policy needs to be implemented, and there are lots of social norms which creates the barrier to implement that at the local level, because we do have some good policy, like for example AEPC has the very good policy and on gender and social inclusion. They have human resources to support that. Similarly, Nepal Electricity Authority also have JC policies in place, but having policy does not translate into the implementation, because there are lots of implementation barriers that we need to tackle.
Okay, I see. Okay, definitely still a long way to go. So I suggest we now take some audience questions. And if everyone, all presenters and also people who didn't present but contributed to the studies could maybe go on video. We have a question to Tushar, so the quantitative study on Nepal. The question is, how do women have higher unrestricted access to smartphones when men have higher smartphone ownership? So it seems to maybe also be a cultural topic in Nepal. So I don't know, Tushar, do you have a suggested answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question, and it baffled me as well. But the scenario where men own more smartphones but women have higher access may arise to the dynamics of household sharing or other social arrangements in the household. I mean, it's possible that men, being the primary owners, may have like more outside obligations to work commitments that require them to share their smartphones with female household members, providing women with more unrestricted access. And conversely, women, like despite owning fewer smartphones, may have more access to these devices within the household setting due to sharing arrangements. Yeah, I mean, we need to dig more in the data to really understand this.
Okay, and our second question to Musna also on, women's empowerment in energy index is a new concept. And I think, as Tushar told us, some people, think you have access to energy, so your empowerment is improved, or your agency, has progressed. But it could be the other way around, that if you already have access to financial resources and various other elements of agency, then that might be the only way to actually get access to clean energy. Just what you mentioned, some areas of disempowerment, that suggest as could be intervention points to improve energy access, energy use. Again, Tusha reminded us those are two very different things. Could you just say a few words about what you would suggest to the government of Nepal? And obviously, I think you said similar studies are ongoing in India. We just didn't have time to present. What should both governments do differently? Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that really showed up in our data was the difference in outcomes in hills and Tarai region. So despite being more egalitarian on sort of empowerment measures and norms around sharing of assets within the household, we do find that generally access is more restrictive, and that could be sort of a more geographic constraint rather than a cultural constraint. So it's in the context of energy, it's very interesting, and also one of the reasons why we focus on access and not ownership, because a lot of times when we talk about energy, we're talking about really sort of capital intensive, monetarily sort of expensive assets that may be owned by one person in the household, but as long as people have access to it, I think that sort of fulfills the need or requirement for that energy source. And so similarly, I think, for Nepal, I think I would really sort of maybe focus on underserved areas more than sort of underserved people, because that seems to be a big constraint in the hills. And we are here also just talking about the mid-hills region. We haven't even been able to go to sort of what is called the Pahar regions or the higher altitude regions, where I would imagine energy access is even lower. And another thing, we couldn't focus on data from India and Pakistan, but we sort of see similar trends in terms of dynamics around disadvantaged caste groups or disadvantaged ethnic groups. So another area to focus on, like we know from previous data in India, for example, that access to smartphones, access to internet is lower among Dalit groups, lower among religious minorities. So some of this is already sort of well documented. So I think one thing certainly to focus on underserved areas, focus on underserved groups, and obviously women from these underserved areas and underserved and disadvantaged groups are going to be doubly disadvantaged. So focus on women from these groups as well.
Okay, that of course leads me to a question to Dr. Nikhil, plus we have another question in the Q&A. So maybe you can comment on I think what Musna said, but also answer the question, the so-called schemes or gender neutral schemes, I think that you also referred to. How do we actually know, and how can we ensure that women really participate in those schemes and benefit from those schemes? So maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course, because when we are applying, we are applying these schemes in the ground level, we actually get the data. We actually get who are the beneficiaries and how our support is actually reaching the beneficiaries. And when I'm talking about that in the solar pumping water schemes, around 20% of the beneficiaries. So we know that they are actually, we have the clicker data that these are the women and they are working in the field. They are working with the help of solar pumps. Similarly, we have different schemes like solar dryer, where we are providing, support for the drying of vegetables. And we have seen the examples where, after drying the vegetables and fruits, they are selling the dry fruits and they are selling the dry vegetables, and their income is increased. Similarly, we have seen the case studies where, we have provided support for the micro irrigation pumps, specifically in the region of Bihar and Jharkhand. And there we have seen the studies where the women group, they create a self-help group, and they have improved their lifestyle, they have improved their income, and they are able to grow more crops just because of this micro irrigation pumps. So because right now we have the access to renewable energies for different aspects like solar energy, bioenergy, and we have the ministries capturing the data at a grassroots level, which actually help us to pinpoint that where we need the intervention. Right now, I have told you that we are coming up with a new scheme, which is basically livelihood. So that is basically kind of a spin-off of the previous schemes. That yes, we need some kind of a decentralized systems which can create some kind of a impact at the grassroots level. And that is why we have developed a few products like solar air dryers, solar refrigerators, which may be useful for the women at the grassroots level and to create some impact.
Okay, very very interesting, and I guess that leads to Neha Durga, who and her colleague Shrishti Mishra, who presented these case studies, and so for India and Nikhil, you pointed out horticultural production, solar dryers, solar refrigerators, some micro irrigation schemes. So Neha and Shrishti, when you did those case studies, did those cases stand out as particularly benefiting women? And again, what else do we need to do in addition to picking, some areas where we know women are engaged? What else do we need to do to make sure that these energy interventions that the ministry is increasingly promoting make a difference? It sounds like as an agreement on self-help groups that they definitely make a difference. Women's self-help groups can help to really transform agency, transform both from the income side and from the agency, women's relations with energy and women actually benefiting from energy access and use. But what else do we need? Great if you could tell us a bit more, Neha, on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Claudia. So yeah, so from our case studies, we saw that these assets or these products which are created, they definitely have the potential to improve income. But there's a lot of other work which needs to be done by the implementers. Essentially, government has made a scheme, but this scheme is actually implemented on ground through different agencies and implementers. So if you give a subsea cooler to a woman, or if a woman basically acquires a subsea cooler through an SHG, if there is a potential, if there is a market already, that then she'd be able to leverage that technology to improve her income. But at the same time, I'll give you another example that if there is no market for a thing, even if you give a product, then it will not sort of improve the income, because essentially there is no market and she is not the one who will create the market. So that is why an intervention design, there's one component of technology or the product, but a market is a much bigger concept. So an intervention design has to be done in a very holistic thing. Second thing, I would give an example of maize sheller. So that is a product which aims at basically aims at basically changing the labor division at household. That if you give a maize sheller which is powered by decentralized energy, will help women reduce her time, because other people can contribute to it. It's like an example of a washing machine, that it reduced the participant barriers and other people started sort of contributing because the work became less difficult. So similarly, but you cannot incentivize other households to do that work just because it's easy. So there has to be more work done at the social level in order to leverage that technology to bring that social change. So that is this entire chain of small activities which have to be done apart from the technological change which the government is definitely promoting. And that's actually the difficult part.
Yeah, interesting. And okay, yes, Dr. Nikhil. And while you answer, I want to know if the Indian government has an objective to get the 15 to 20% beneficiary share of women up to 50%. Maybe you can also answer that at the same time.
Actually, I can say that there is no clear-cut right now a number we have, but yes, we're promoting at a different level, because there are different schemes. When I'm talking about solar energy, we are talking about grid connected power plants. So there, I cannot say that there is a 50% women intervention is required, but at a different level, I can say that yes, it may be more than 50%. So we are not defining any clear-cut number, but yes, we are picking different schemes which would be women-centric. And I would also like to add that we are also having the skilling program for different activities. For example, for the solar energy, we are having capacity building program, which is known as Surya Mitra. Similarly, for the wind energy, we are also having the Vayu Mitra program, which is basically to promote the capacity building of men and women. And we have specifically organized training programs specifically for the women categories. So this is one of the steps through which the ministry is promoting, of course, not only the schemes, not only the technologies, support, but also the capacity building of different self-help groups.
That's excellent. And in fact, that gets me back to Resha, Pia, because I think I read somewhere that you have been supporting a community of practice of women energy engineer specialists. Could you just tell us a word or two about that, please?
Yeah, you are correct. Actually, as everyone is saying that the woman participation and meaningful contribution to any decision making process is very weak. Yeah, during the COVID period, we thought that since we do have a very lack of information also, because we are we work in the office, we do have a household responsibility. In addition to that, we do have a community responsibility. Therefore, we have 24 hours in a day and we need to divide those time, and we don't have enough time to do research and do learnings, like a man counterparts. Therefore, what we thought was, let us have a group. It's a very informal group, but it was started with the 8-9 member initially, because in the COVID period we don't go to the office and we don't have much information what's going on into the office as well as into the sector. Therefore, we thought whatever we know, let us just include that in this messenger group so that the women who are working in this energy sector knows about it. But I think this momentum has increased such a lot that now currently there are more than 90 women members added to that group. And whenever there is a new information about energy sector, we just share that information in those groups so that women who don't have a time to just turn the newspaper or look at the Google it, they can refer to that what's the new changes that's going into the energy sector. And also regarding the vacancies also, because sometimes we don't see advertisement, we don't have time to see the advertisement, therefore we miss that opportunity despite we are qualified. Therefore we thought, and if there is any vacancy in this sector, then we just post there so that woman has an instant message, and then they can see the vacancy whether that's relevant to them or not, and they can apply. Therefore this is very informal network, but I think the good part is this network has been now, it's recognized. It's not registered, but still it's recognized by the World Bank, FCDO and USAID. Therefore whenever there is any program that FCDO, USAID or World Bank they try to do, they just request us to post in this informal network so that most of the women working in this sector has access to the information center. Once there is access to the information, it's a woman to decide whether they want to participate or not. And lots of capacity building activities like World Bank, FCDO and the USAID has designed based on this. And I would say it's working quite well.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's an excellent example. And in fact, the CGIAR initiative on NEXUS Gains has been holding several summer schools, also events, I think, for the government to incorporate some of those energy considerations in the irrigation reform policies, etc. So I think that's excellent. And I hope that all of the information and even the webinar today that we can feed the video, the summary video and the papers that have already been published into this channel. So I really hope that we can also, as CGIAR, benefit from this existing community of practice. And obviously an invitation to Dr. Nikhil to, also consider maybe, or some of his colleagues to consider such a very informal community of practice for India. And across South Asia, I think that would also be nice, so that we also have some learnings from across the countries. And
just to add on, like a good part
okay.
of this platform is like they are representative, women representative from government, INGOs, private sector, and the development partners like us. Therefore, whenever there is certain questions that we need to answer, we just float our questions in that platform.
Perfect.
And there are lots of very good response coming from the women, which we have never thought about, Therefore, it's really a helpful platform for us to learn and take a view of like more than 90 women at once,
Okay, with this, we unfortunately have to close. We are now out of time. I'd like to thank each and every one of our presenters and also our panelists for joining us today. What I felt was an extremely informative and important discussion. I learned a lot, including about a new network. And our next Nexus Gains webinar will take place on October 18. In honor of World Food Day, which this year focuses on water under the topic Water is Life, Water is Food. So another very important topic. So I hope all of you can join us again. And just one more time, thanks to everyone for joining us today. And goodbye.